The fire began around 0:54 a.m. on June 14, 2017, in the kitchen of apartment 16 on the 4th floor. The resident, Behailu Kebede, was woken up by the smoke alarm and called the fire department upon seeing flames coming from behind the refrigerator. When firefighters arrived, just 5 minutes after the call, the fire had already escaped through the windows, fueled by wind and the tower's exterior cladding. According to information from the BBC, this cladding was made of aluminum panels with a polyethylene PE core, a highly flammable plastic material. Once reached by flames, the polyethylene melted, dripped, and spread fire easily, releasing large amounts of heat. The fire spread through the vertical cavities of the facade and quickly reached all sides of the building. The renovation of the tower, completed in 2016 by the company Ryden, also involved the use of flammable materials in windows and insulation, as well as the installation of exposed gas pipes, factors that increased the structure's vulnerability. The project was approved without authorities requiring effective safety tests for these modifications. Country: United Kingdom. City: London. Location: Grenfell Tower, North Kensington neighborhood. Date: June 14, 2017. People involved: residents, fire department, local authorities, and companies responsible for the renovation. It was early morning in London when, around 0:54 a.m. on June 14, 2017, a smoke alarm echoed inside an apartment at Grenfell Tower. Behailu Kebede, a resident of the 4th floor, was abruptly woken by the noise and, upon leaving his bedroom, was faced with something terrifying: flames coming from behind the refrigerator. He quickly called the fire department, describing the start of what seemed like a manageable fire at that moment. But no one could have imagined that, in the next few hours, that small fire would turn into a national tragedy. 5 minutes after the call, the first fire trucks were already on site. Even with the rapid response, the fire had already begun escaping through the windows, fueled by the winds of the night. And there was something even more dangerous: the building's exterior cladding. According to reports later released by the BBC, this cladding was made of aluminum panels with a polyethylene core, a highly flammable plastic material. When exposed to heat, the polyethylene melted, dripped, and spread the fire with alarming speed. In addition, it released large amounts of heat and toxic smoke, making the environment even more lethal. The flames found the perfect space to climb: the vertical cavities of the facade. Within minutes, the fire was spreading along all sides of the building. It was as if the very structure of the building was helping the fire grow. Residents woke up terrified, many not understanding what was happening. That night would mark not only London but the entire world. Grenfell Tower was a 24-story residential building located in the North Kensington neighborhood of London, built in the 1970s as part of a housing project intended to provide affordable housing for low-income families. Over the years, it became a symbol of the city's cultural diversity, housing people from different ethnicities, religions, and social backgrounds, many of them immigrants or economically vulnerable communities. Despite its social importance, the building often suffered criticism regarding its outdated infrastructure and lack of preventive maintenance, which had already raised concerns among residents long before the renovation. In 2016, after years of complaints and demands, the tower underwent a complete renovation aimed at modernizing its facade, improving thermal insulation, and making the building visually more attractive. However, this renovation, which was supposed to bring comfort and security to the residents, ended up becoming one of the main factors contributing to the tragedy about to unfold. The project was carried out by the company Ryden, responsible for several other works on public buildings, and supervised by municipal agencies in charge of approving the construction work. Although presented as a lasting solution to the structural problems of the tower, the limited budget of the renovation led to choices of materials and methods that prioritized cost-effectiveness over extreme safety. One of those materials, as we will see later, was precisely the external cladding, composed of aluminum panels with a polyethylene core, whose high flammability would be decisive in the rapid spread of the flames. In addition, the tests conducted before the installation of this cladding were considered insufficient and did not simulate real fire scenarios, resulting in a false sense of security. Another flaw identified later was the use of windows made with also highly combustible materials, which helped spread the fire from one apartment to another. Additionally, the ventilation systems and the cavities existing between the external cladding and the original structure of the building functioned as real chimneys, further accelerating the spread of the fire. Gas pipelines installed during the renovation were left exposed in some parts of the building, further increasing the risk of explosions and secondary ignition. Many residents reported, after the event, having noticed flaws and irregularities during the work, but their voices were ignored by the competent authorities. Over time, the building became a silent ticking bomb, whose explosion only depended on a spark. And that spark came in the early morning of June 14th, inside a small fourth-floor apartment, where a defect in a refrigerator would trigger one of the largest urban tragedies in British history. The Grenfell Tower renovation, completed in 2016, had as its main objective to update the appearance of the building, which looked visibly aged and out of standard compared to the new buildings rising around it. However, while the initial intention seemed positive, the way the project was conducted revealed a series of technical and bureaucratic negligence that would put hundreds of lives at risk just a few months later. Among the main elements used in this renovation were the external cladding panels, manufactured by Arconic, consisting of 2 aluminum sheets with a polyethylene core, a plastic material known for its low fire resistance. This type of panel is widely used in civil construction because it is light, economical, and easy to install, but when subjected to intense heat from a fire, it behaves like a true fire accelerator. Subsequent studies showed that under normal test conditions, this cladding could allow fire to rise up to 15 meters in less than 2 minutes, which, in a 24-story building, meant covering the entire height in a matter of minutes. During the renovation, the cladding was applied without including vertical fire barriers, which are used to prevent fire from spreading rapidly along the sides of the building. This absence was crucial for the flames to climb so quickly, turning the entire building into a giant torch within hours. In addition to the cladding, other parts of the renovation also brought significant risks, such as the replacement of windows with PVC frames, another highly flammable material. These windows were identical to those used in other buildings that had previously suffered fires, but they were still approved without rigorous analysis. Another serious detail was the decision to keep only one access staircase inside the building, which would make any attempt at collective evacuation extremely difficult. The apartment doors were also not certified fire-resistant, drastically reducing the protection time against flame advancement inside the units. Also during the renovation, exposed gas pipelines were installed in the internal corridors, something unusual in residential buildings, and that represented an additional danger if the fire reached those areas. Furthermore, the building's electrical system, which was already old, was not fully updated, keeping cables and connections that could facilitate short circuits and ignitions. The authorities responsible for approving the project accepted all the materials used without requiring complete fire resistance tests, relying only on documentation provided by the contracted companies. This combination of mistaken choices, lack of rigorous technical supervision, and pressure for lower costs created an extreme risk scenario, and the tragedy was about to become real. On that night, shortly after Behailu Kebede called the fire department, the fire began to spread with alarming speed, thanks exactly to the materials used in the tower's renovation. Within minutes, the flames had already left the fourth-floor apartment and started climbing up the side of the building, propelled by the plastic cladding that melted and dripped, spreading embers upward and sideways. The wind that night, although not very strong, was enough to push the flames beyond the starting point, helping them reach the upper floors with incredible speed. Witnesses reported seeing the fire climbing like a vertical wave, covering an entire face of the building in less than 10 minutes. This was largely due to the cavities existing between the cladding and the building structure, which acted as real chimneys, channeling the heat and oxygen necessary to keep the flames alive. Inside the building, panic grew among the residents who were waking up startled by the smell of burning and the sound of screams coming from the corridors. Many ran to the stairs but found a single escape route already filled with thick, toxic smoke, making breathing almost impossible. Some tried to escape through the roof, but the building had no helipad or safe area prepared for aerial rescue, which would further complicate the firefighters' work. Windows exploded due to the intense heat, throwing shards onto the street and making it harder for emergency teams to access the building. Despite the heroic efforts of the firefighters, who arrived in significant numbers with appropriate equipment, the fire was already too advanced to be contained inside the building. The water hoses couldn't efficiently reach the upper floors, and nearby hydrants had insufficient pressure to supply the trucks. The situation was chaotic, and the scene resembled more a movie scene than a reality in one of the most developed cities in the world. Families were trapped, often with small children, elderly people, and individuals with disabilities without clear escape options. It was evident that this was no longer just a fire, it was a human catastrophe unfolding in real time. Inside Grenfell Tower, chaos set in quickly, with residents running back and forth in search of any way to escape the inferno consuming the building. Some people followed official guidelines to stay indoors, believing the fire would be quickly controlled, but this strategy proved fatal for many. Without clear warnings or precise instructions on how to act, residents were at the mercy of the fire, unsure whether they should try to go down the stairs or take refuge inside the apartments. The stairs, which should have been the main escape route, became zones of risk, with thick, toxic smoke invading the corridors and making any movement difficult. Many of the building's emergency lights failed, plunging the upper floors into complete darkness, further increasing fear and confusion. Family members of desperate victims watched everything from outside, shouting names, pleading for news, and praying for their loved ones to appear at the windows or manage to escape. Shocking images captured by amateur cameras showed people hanging from balconies, breaking glass, begging for help, and, in some cases, jumping to escape the flames. A mother and her baby were filmed being rescued by a neighbor who, using tied sheets, managed to pull them up to a safe apartment several floors above. But not everyone was so lucky. There are reports of parents watching their children disappear into the flames before their eyes, unable to do anything to save them. Inside the building, the heat was so intense that simple objects like toys and furniture began catching fire spontaneously, even without direct contact with flames. Some survivors later reported that, when trying to open their apartment doors, they felt a wave of heat so strong it prevented them from exiting, forcing them to retreat. The fire, combined with the smoke and general panic, created a completely hostile environment where every second counted and luck seemed to be the only factor separating life from death. Meanwhile, firefighters faced unimaginable challenges. Climbing through smoke-filled staircases, dragging heavy hoses up dozens of floors, and trying to rescue people in desperate situations. Many of them entered the building knowing they might not return, yet still went forward, fulfilling their duty with courage and determination. With each passing minute, the tragedy gained greater dimensions, and London began to realize it would witness one of the saddest pages of its recent history. As firefighters arrived at the scene, they quickly realized they were facing a large-scale fire unlike any they had encountered before. Within minutes, more than 200 personnel and 40 vehicles were on site, fighting a fire that had already consumed most of the tower's facade. Despite all their training and experience, the firefighters faced an extremely complex situation. A tall building with only one central staircase, flammable cladding, and an uncertain number of people still inside. Equipped with breathing masks and protective gear, the first teams entered the building with the mission of locating and rescuing survivors, while others positioned hoses to contain the fire spread. However, the thick, toxic smoke made visibility nearly impossible, and the intense heat pushed equipment to its limits. Many firefighters had to alternate between entering and exiting the building, as the physical effort combined with high temperatures required constant breaks to prevent fainting or serious injuries. Some of the most emotional rescues were carried out by teams who climbed dozens of floors with heavy equipment, risking their own lives to save civilians trapped inside. One of the most memorable moments was the rescue of an elderly woman who was unconscious inside her apartment, surrounded by flames. 2 firefighters entered the room, carried the victim, and took her to the stairs, where another team escorted her to the ground floor for immediate medical assistance. There was also the case of a family who barely escaped thanks to a firefighter who guided them through a hallway almost completely engulfed in smoke. Meanwhile, external teams used long-range water jets to reach the upper floors, although the height of the building and the intensity of the fire made this strategy less effective. Helicopters hovered over the area but could not perform aerial rescues due to the lack of a proper helipad on the roof. As the hours passed, the physical and emotional fatigue of the firefighters increased, especially when hearing cries for help from inside the building. Many of them cried upon realizing that, despite all efforts, some people could not be saved, and the reality of the tragedy began to weigh heavily on everyone present. Yet, none of the firefighters abandoned their posts, continuing to work tirelessly until the flames were finally contained hours later, leaving behind a scene of total destruction. In the days following the fire, London and the world watched in shock at the devastating aftermath left by the Grenfell Tower fire. In the early hours after the fire, medical and emergency teams worked tirelessly to identify the injured and locate possible survivors still inside the building. However, it soon became clear that many lives had been lost, and that the task of identifying the bodies would be extremely difficult due to the intensity of the fire and the damage caused to the remains. Authorities opened a family assistance center for desperate relatives seeking news about their loved ones, while forensic experts began the delicate work of collecting and analyzing DNA samples. The upper floors of the building were completely charred, and parts of the structure had collapsed under their own weight, making entry for rescuers even riskier. Amid the chaos, police confirmed that the death toll would surpass initial expectations, and it quickly became evident that this would be the largest urban disaster in British history since World War II. Many families reported losing multiple members from the same household. Parents, children, grandparents, and even babies were found together, victims of a cruel and inevitable fate. One of the most moving cases was that of an entire Syrian family who had migrated to the UK seeking safety and a future, but who ended up losing all 6 family members in the fire. Another family consisting of a mother and her 3 young children also had no survivors, shocking the community and leading to protests against the failures that allowed the fire to spread so quickly. Authorities faced criticism for the slowness of the identification process, as the complexity of the analysis required time, patience, and technical resources beyond the usual capacity. Even with available technology, some bodies could only be identified weeks later, and in some cases, human remains were found months after the fire, hidden among the rubble. The official death toll was updated several times, but by the end of the process, it was confirmed that 72 people lost their lives that night, including children, elderly individuals, and adults of all ages. For each of these victims, there was a life story interrupted, dreams cut short, and families emotionally destroyed in an instant that forever changed the North Kensington neighborhood. But the question hanging in the air was inevitable. How could something like this have happened in the 21st century, in one of the world's greatest capitals? In the streets of London, the reaction to the Grenfell Tower fire was immediate, and within days, popular demonstrations gained momentum, demanding justice, transparency, and accountability. Local residents, family members of the victims, and activists united in silent protests and shouts of outrage in front of the authorities who seemed to have cost so many lives. Hundreds of people gathered in front of the building, lighting candles, leaving flowers, and writing messages in tribute to the dead, transforming the location into a space of collective mourning. Social media filled with videos, testimonies, and difficult questions. Why were flammable materials used? Who approved these projects? How was this risk ignored? Community groups organized emergency meetings, denouncing years of neglect toward housing areas intended for low-income families, where safety was often overlooked. Religious leaders and local politicians also spoke out, demanding urgent answers from municipal and governmental authorities regarding how such an important renovation project ended in tragedy. One of the biggest criticisms was directed at the local council, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, accused of prioritizing appearances and economy over the safety of the residents. In addition, the company responsible for the renovation, Ryden, and the manufacturer of the cladding panels, Arconic, became frequent targets of investigations and public criticism, being called to account. Witnesses revealed that before the fire, there had already been complaints about electrical faults, faulty alarm systems, and doors that jammed during evacuation drills, warnings that were ignored. During subsequent investigations, Documents emerged showing that fire resistance tests conducted with the cladding used on the tower had yielded poor results. Yet it was installed anyway. The lack of vertical fire barriers, the choice of inappropriate materials, and the absence of a clear fire safety policy were pointed out as the main technical errors that led to the disaster. Meanwhile, the survivors struggled to rebuild their lives, without homes, documents, and in many cases, without adequate support from the government. Some had to wait months to receive temporary housing, and many complained about bureaucracy and institutional coldness throughout the process. Public outrage grew so much that in September 2017, a major demonstration brought thousands of people marching through the streets of London, demanding justice for the victims of Grenfell Tower. They carried posters with photos of the victims, repeating names loudly and delivering a single, clear message: never again. Never let this happen again. In the months following the fire, a formal investigation was launched to determine the exact causes of the disaster and identify which institutions and individuals could be held accountable. The public inquiry, led by Judge Sir Martin Morbick, lasted for years and heard testimony from hundreds of witnesses, including fire safety experts, engineers, public officials, and representatives of the companies involved. Among the main focuses of the investigation was the use of polyethylene core cladding panels, whose flammability was considered one of the most decisive factors in the rapid spread of the fire. It was revealed that although safer alternatives were available on the market, the chosen material was the most economical, prioritizing cost over the protection of the residents. Furthermore, the safety tests performed before installation were deemed insufficient because they did not simulate real fire conditions at high altitudes, which would have revealed the actual risks. The lack of vertical fire barriers in the cladding was also highlighted as a serious flaw, as they could have prevented the fire from climbing so quickly. Another flaw noted was the decision not to install automatic fire detectors in all apartments, which delayed the general alert and reduced the residents' response time. The building's ventilation system, which connected the floors, also helped spread toxic smoke rapidly, endangering even those far from the initial source. The investigation also pointed out serious flaws in coordination between the responsible authorities, including the local council, fire department, and companies contracted for the renovation. There were reports that some technicians warned about the risks of the selected material, but their recommendations were ignored due to pressure from costs and deadlines. The company Arconic, manufacturer of the panels, eventually removed the product from its European catalog after the fire, indirectly admitting that it was not safe for use in high-rise residential buildings. The construction company Ryden, responsible for executing the renovation, faced numerous criticisms but denied any direct responsibility, arguing that it followed current technical standards. Despite all the evidence presented, the judicial process was slow, and to this day, no individual or company has been criminally convicted for the incident, generating frustration among the families of the victims. The investigation concluded that the Grenfell Tower fire was the result of a series of mistaken decisions, regulatory failures, and a complete lack of priority given to the safety of the residents. This tragedy served as a sad reminder that when economy prevails over life, the price paid is often irreparable. The Grenfell Tower fire left a deep and painful legacy, not just in London but around the world, reigniting debates about safety in social housing, urban rights, and social justice. It exposed the profound inequalities that persist in big cities, where vulnerable communities are often relegated to poorly maintained spaces and subjected to unnecessary risks. The tragedy also brought to light the urgent need for a review of construction regulations, especially concerning the use of flammable materials in high-rise residential buildings. After the fire, countries such as France, Germany, and the United States banned or restricted the use of polyethylene core panels in building facades, adopting preventive measures to avoid similar incidents. In the UK, new legislation was introduced requiring stricter fire resistance testing and the elimination of highly flammable materials in new constructions and renovations. Additionally, the British government created remediation programs to replace dangerous cladding in hundreds of residential buildings across the country. However, many experts warn that there is still much to be done, as thousands of buildings worldwide still use similar materials, and enforcement is not always effective. The memory of the 72 victims of Grenfell Tower remains alive in monuments, books, documentaries, and social movements that seek to ensure that stories like this never happen again. Families of the victims remain mobilized, demanding justice, reparation, and transparency, reminding the world that true change begins with listening and accountability. This video was produced to honor that memory, to inform and educate, but also to provoke reflection and action. If you made it this far, it means you care, and that alone is a start. Share this content so that more people can learn about this story and understand the importance of demanding safety, transparency, and dignity in our cities. Leave a like if you believe we should learn from the mistakes of the past to build a fairer and safer future. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take this opportunity to join this journey of knowledge and awareness. Together, we can ensure that tragedies like Grenfell Tower never happen again.